So a lot of people have been asking me to make a Pool 4 and Pool 5 or Series 4, Series 5 tier list to tell you guys which are the best cards to save up your tokens for. So here it is. Here's my list. I'm going to go over why I put things in the different spots. Let's take a look. So at the very top of this list are the cards that I think everyone should pick up. They're pretty much used in they're used in a lot of decks. You can use them like not only in decks built specifically for them, but also in decks that just kind of splash them in. I've been running Shuri in a couple just good stuff lists. Just throw Shuri and Vision or Shuri and some other cards, but you can also build a whole deck around Shuri. Shuri might be the strongest card in the entire game, not just Pool 4 and Pool 5. Silver Surfer equally might be the strongest card as well. I think they're pretty far up there with Shuri. This card adding 3 power to all of your 3-cost units is just absolutely insane. You drop this on the last turn, it can add like crazy power. If you get it with a Wong, even crazier power. But I'd say decks without Wong with Silver Surfer are actually kind of better because you're not telegraphing where you're going to play it. Silver Surfer is a must-have in this meta, I think. It might be the strongest archetype right now. Next up, we have Bast, which is a little bit more niche of a card than the top two. This is only A tier. It plays into very specific decks. You generally run decks that all have less than 3 power, and Bast will buff all those cards up. So it's pretty much like an old Nokia. From the beta, Nokia used to buff your whole hand for +2. This one basically buffs your whole hand for up to 3. So if you have cards less than 3, it'll bump them all up there. It can be played in lists like Cerebro 3 or just any sort of zoo list that runs a lot of really small stuff, and negative lists as well. So there's a lot of different Bast lists out there, and it's just really strong, adds a lot of power for 1 cost. It's really good. Next up is the Season Pass card that is right now. So technically it is not in Series 5 yet, but will be dropping there next month. So I included it here. I think Zabu, from playing it out, it is very strong in the right lists, and this coming month there are more cards coming out that are 4 costs that maybe can combo with Zabu even more. We'll have to see how good those are. I did include them here just from my initial thoughts, but we'll take a look at them as the month goes on and we'll see how good they are. Zabu, I do think, is strong with the right lists. It is also another card that you can splash in Zabu and just like 2 or 3 4-drops. You don't need to make a full Zabu list for it to be strong. It is just strong to get this out on 3 and then like 2 4-drops on 4, and that could be all you do with it and it's still really strong. But yeah, full Zabu list still pretty good. Speaking of Zabu lists, I think Darkhawk, which is 2 over here, is one of the stronger cards that you can put in a Zabu list. I think the best Zabu lists all run Darkhawk and Rock Slide. Darkhawk is not that useful, I think, outside of the Zabu list. There are some that run it to like pretty good effect, but it's a pretty middling card, I feel like, without Zabu. But with Zabu, it becomes a very strong card and probably a good pickup for specifically the Zabu lists. And then we have She-Hulk, which is just an overall really strong 6-drop, and as 6-drop, I mean, it can drop usually all the way down to, like, you can drop it out on turn 4, usually at the earliest, as a 3-drop if you full skip your turn 3, or a 1-drop if you full skip your turn 5. So you can get Moon Girl shenanigans going on with She-Hulk. You can play out 2 of them. It's really strong. I think this card, a lot of people put She-Hulk in S tier. I do think that Shuri and Silver Surfer are just in a tier of their own, so I couldn't include She-Hulk in there with them. And I do think that Bast and Zabu are a little bit more meta breaking in the sense that they create these kind of cool archetypes you wouldn't necessarily have, where She-Hulk is kind of just an extra powerful drop in like the Death Wave decks and some other Moon Girl kind of skip turn decks. Valkyrie is one of the cards that I think combos really well in like the Bast lists, and just a really good strong tech card that a lot of people didn't actually realize how strong it was until it started being played a little bit more as more people are acquiring it. It's still pretty unobtainable for most people just because it is Series 5 and there are just like those better Series 5 cards that people are trying to get right now. But I do think I've played a couple of Valk lists and they all are very strong. It seems like you kind of have to learn how to play the card a bit. It does take a learning curve. So if you were to pick this up, don't be frustrated if you like start losing a little bit with it. It takes a little bit of a learning curve to be able to play it optimally. And then again with the learning curve, Thanos. I think Thanos might be the highest skill cap card in the game. It is very hard to play out. You have all of the different stones that have the different abilities on them that are very difficult to use optimally. So I think it is one of those decks that like has very high potential, but you really have to learn how to play the deck and play it really optimally. And by the deck, I mean there are a bunch of Thanos decks. So you can splash Thanos into a bunch of decks. It just gives you a bunch of 1-drops. So you can play like a deck with a really high curve, and then just throw Thanos in there, and then you get a bunch of 1-drops that help you fill out that curve a little bit. So Thanos is really good. It also combos really well with Bast and Valkyrie because you have those smaller 1-drop stones that you can buff up to 3 power. And you can also play Thanos with like Blue Marvel and Khazar to buff them up. I think that's one of the better lists with Thanos. But yeah, also just like a discard or a Dracula list with like Lockjaw is also pretty good with Thanos. There are a lot of lists out there with Thanos in it. And then next up we have Absorbing Man. In this meta right now, Absorbing Man seems to be in all the Zabu decks. With Zabu, it's actually insane to play it out with a bunch of different cards like Rockslide, Spider-Man, even like Shang-Chi and Arrow, you can copy those cards. But when Absorbing Man is only 2 power, you really see how powerful this card is because you can play Absorbing Man to copy one of the effects of your previous cards, or you could play two of one of your cards in one turn, basically. Like double Spider-Man in one turn is actually insane. So if you didn't like Moon Girl your Spider-Man and you want to just play 2 Spider-Man to block 2 lanes on turn 5, it can be really insane. Absorbing Man really strong with Zabu and some of the other cards that kind of are strong with Zabu as well. So that is like a pretty good pickup right now, specifically for that Zabu list. It wasn't played too much before that. It was played in some niche decks. It is still pretty strong without the Zabu, but I think I would have put Absorbing Man in B tier if it wasn't for Zabu, and Zabu kind of bumps that up to A. Next is Galactus. Galactus is the first card on this list that is getting a nerf. So it's getting a nerf in the future. So I guess the developers think that Galactus is the best card out of all these cards. I guess the data might show that, but I do think that the data might be a little bit misleading because I think Galactus is one of those cards that might seem strong, but if the play rate ever went up too much, more people would be aware of the Galactus happenings. They would tech in a few cards that ruin Galactus. So it's one of those cards that as it becomes more popular and it gets teched against, it just becomes worse and worse. So it is like for a surprise play, a very strong card, because when you get that surprise play off, it's usually the case that you're going to win the game. So it's like one of those cards that just has a early win condition, but it's not going to farm a lot of cubes because when you get that Galactus off and you know you have the cards to back it up and the opponent doesn't have any sort of tech to really try and stay in, most of the time they're going to be retreating, so you're not going to get 8 cubes with Galactus most of the time. Next up is Titania. Another hard card to use, I think. I think Titania is very strong, but it's like difficult to use in the early game. Obviously, if you play it out on turn 6 without priority, you're going to be able to just drop a 1/5, which is really powerful. It's one of the biggest cards that you can play for 1 power. Potentially the biggest card you can play for 1 power. But I think Titania, a lot of times it can grief you if you like play it out a little bit early and your opponent ends up stealing it. But it's a really good card that can block some locations that a lot of people don't realize that you can play like Titania. I've had this happen to me. I actually played it myself, but someone played Titania and then Green Goblin to send the Titania over, send the Goblin over, and it gave me both of those cards and blocked my lane completely. And then at the end of the game, they can just play one more card there and steal the Titania back. So it's one of those things that can combo really well, really lock down some locations from your opponent, and they might not realize exactly how many cards that you can put on their side all on one turn to block them up. So it's a really strong card, I think. I put it in A tier just because it is just a high power card for its cost, and it's just really good. So for the S and A tiers, I think these are all cards worth saving up tokens for if you are Series 3 complete and you're looking to get some Series 4, Series 5 cards. I think these cards are up there on the cards that you want to get to make some cool decks. Anything else below here, I think, is going to be like much more niche, and like I think only the B tier ones are things that you can maybe consider spending some tokens on. I think C and D are going to be cards that you want to avoid spending tokens on. You might open up them randomly from the collection track, and I think, yeah, maybe you can then test out some more meme decks with them, but usually all of the cards down below are going to be able to be replaced with better cards that you could get outside of Series 4 and 5. So in B tier, I think Luke Cage has some playable decks, has some playability where you can pop him into a couple decks, and he is pretty good. He's pretty good with Valkyrie, actually, because the cards don't get reduced if you have some bigger cards and you Valkyrie them. He's really good with Hazmat, which is actually getting a buff coming up to get 1 more power, so maybe that Hazmat deck will be a little bit better. But 1 power, I don't know if it'll make the archetype above like a B tier deck, so we'll have to see about that. But yeah, I think Luke Cage is probably the top one of this B that like is maybe playable enough to consider picking up. But I wouldn't save up tokens or pin this in your shop. I think the next 3 are all new cards that are not out yet as of me recording this, so I am not positive how good these cards are. But looking at them, I do think that Sauron itself could combo pretty well with a couple archetypes. So Sauron will disable all of the ongoing effects for your cards in your hand and your deck, which means that you could play this basically as a 0 for a lot of those cards. So it's basically like a 0 that zeros your entire deck. So except it doesn't remove non-ongoing abilities, but it could be pretty good with 0-like cards like Red Skull or Mary. So I think that Sauron could be playable potentially, which is why I put him in B here, because I think anything in B is like, it could be good in some lists and could be playable. It just won't be like an A list or an S tier list, I think. Next up is Shanna. Shanna plays a 1-drop at each of your locations. I think that could be potentially playable in some lists. It might be playable since it's a 4-drop in a Zabu list. So if you're playing Shanna Khazar, it might be a list that you could play because Khazar will buff up your 1-drops as the Shanna drops. And you might even play Dazzler in that. So Dazzler is a card that if you fill up all 3 locations with 4 cards, it becomes a 4/10. So a 4/10 is just a high power 4-cost unit. It's something that is higher than most other cards. I think only Mary and Attuma, I think, are the other 4/10s. So I think that Dazzler has the potential to be good in maybe a Zabu, Shanna, Khazar, Dazzler list. Something like that could be pretty good, I think. It might be B tier. It might be better. It's hard to say without these cards coming out. So I'm putting it in B tier for now because it seems like it might be a more niche deck, but for all I know, this could end up being like an S tier deck. But I doubt that, but it is possible because I think these cards just need to be played around with a bit. When I looked at Shanna, I was like, oh, putting 3 1-drops, random 1-drops in each of my lanes, that could really grief me. So it's like, that's a little bit questionable about what could happen there, and I'm not really sure how good that will be on average. So we're really gonna have to wait and see for those, but we'll put them B for now. Might update this list in the future once we have them out. Orca also coming out. It's coming out next week with the patch. It was previously bugged, so it didn't come out when it was supposed to. Orca is basically a 6/14 when it's the only card in the lane, similar to like Namor. So Orca will be just like a basically a Giganto that you can play into any lane if it's the only card there, which is actually pretty good. So I think it could be playable, and that means that it goes in B because I think it's not going to be like super overpowered or anything, but it might be something that you splash into a couple decks somewhere here and there just to drop a 6/14. Because if you think about it, like Destroyer is a 6/15. It doesn't have the stipulation that it can be the only card there, but a lot of times you are playing it into a lane as the only card, just because maybe Professor X in another lane you play it. So this is like 1 less power than Destroyer is currently, and you can play it out just by itself on the last turn to try and sneak a lane. It might be good with things like Claw or Mr. Fantastic to get a little bit of extra power into those other lanes, plus this. So it is possible that it could be good. Attuma is a card that I think it seems like it has high potential, but it is really hard to get it to play out very, very well. It is something that's good against something like Leader. So if someone leaders your Attuma, their Attuma might die while yours might not if you play it into a lane by itself and then they had a card there. So it is something like that that's a good counter. It is also playable with cards like Armor and Invisible Wound, so it won't die. It is a 4/10, which like Dazzler is just overstated 4-drop, so it is good in that way, and that's why it's in B tier, because it seems somewhat playable, but not worth picking up, I think, from the shop. All right, then we go down to C tier. All of these cards, I think, are overrated by some people. And I put them down here. They are somewhat playable in some decks, but I definitely don't think you should be picking these up. And even though you could play them in some decks, I think they will be worse than you think. And I think that they should be replaced by other ones. Agent Coulson, I think, is one that a lot of people play out of this list the most. And Agent Coulson is maybe playable in some decks to like good value, just because you can play him out on 3. It gives you a 4 and a 5. I think that random cards, though, are going to be much less consistent in your deck than just putting in a better like 3-drop, putting in just a better 4-drop than whatever you get from Agent Coulson. It is maybe going to be good in some sort of list that want to keep hand size big or that struggle with having enough cards to play out. But I do think that it is not generally worth it to play Coulson, even though it is maybe the best of these cards. Maria Hill, similarly, you play a 2-drop on turn 2. That's a 2/3, so it's like a very underwhelming 2-drop. And then you get a random 1-drop, which is also going to be potentially underwhelming because you don't really want many 1-drops in a list, but it is just another thing that's generating another card. So again, it's like if you want to keep your hand size big, you can kind of play this card. But 1-drops you can play out pretty easily, so maybe you're not even keeping your hand size that big. So in general, I think like just playing like Sentinel in your deck is going to be better than Maria Hill most of the time. So I don't think that that card is going to be very playable, like for at least, unless there's some other synergy that comes up in the future. And then Knull, it felt like it could be a really strong card, but it really is not that strong of a card. I tried it in so many different decks. Even in Galactus, it felt like unnecessary because you're generally winning if you... And I think the best Galactus decks don't run Knull, actually, because I think there's other combos that are generally better with Galactus now, with the meta evolving around people playing around Galactus a little, so you need to play Galactus a little bit differently than just playing Galactus out on 5, playing Knull and Death and whatever on turn 6. Like, that doesn't generally work as much anymore against seasoned players that know how Galactus works. So I think Knull is kind of unnecessary in that sense. There aren't really many other strong decks that play Knull. Like, we tried a bunch of other ones that end up killing cards and trying to get a big Knull out there. Like, you can even play some cheese that, like, Arnim Zol is the Knull, which would double the value of whatever the Knull is at, basically, in 2 different locations. Those decks are just all really inconsistent and not very good. I would highly recommend not picking up Knull just because it is just not a very strong card right now. Maybe in the future, if new cards come out that kind of support it, it might get better, but currently I don't think it's going to be that good. And if they ever fix Yondu to not count as killing a card, I think Knull will be considerably worse again, so like even worse. So I am not sure that you want to pick that card up. Next is Shadow King. First looked at Shadow King, I was like, oh man, this card is insane. I think it's broken. It might be good in the Zabu list, but I'm putting it down here for now because I think it is one of those cards that deceptively looks strong, but it's not. I think it's just, it turns out that it's like probably like a worse Valkyrie. It is 4 cost, so that means in a Zabu list, it could be a decent tech card because it could drop down to 2, and Valkyrie can't do that. So Shadow King removes all of the like added power bonuses to cards. So if someone Shuri'd a card, if someone Silver Surfer'd a card, it'll bring it back down to its base cost. Which I would put this kind of like, if you think of like Enchantress, kind of does a similar thing to like ongoing stuff. Like it takes whatever the base is of the ongoing thing and then removes any of the bonuses. So Shadow King is kind of the same, but it doesn't affect ongoing cards as a thing. So it'll bring cards back down to their base, but then like the ongoing effects will then apply again and add it back up. So it not affecting ongoing effects and only buff cards means that you have to be able to play this out generally on the later turns, like turn 5 or 6, as like kind of like a Shang-Chi type thing. And in that case, why don't you just play Shang-Chi? Why don't you just blow up the big cards? If they're big enough to blow up with Shang-Chi, the only reason you might play this instead is if they have like an armor in the lane. But Cosmo's still going to be blocking this. I think it's just going to be a worse tech card than Enchantress, Valkyrie, Shang-Chi. So I think I'm putting it down in C because it does seem like it might not be that good of a tech card. Just personally, I think it might be like Super Skrull, where it seems like the next card down here in D, where it's like in the right certain meta, if it became popular, it could become a good tech card, but it's not that good of a tech card in this meta. Both Super Skrull and Shadow King being 4-drops means that they are going to be playable with Zabu potentially in certain metas. So Super Skrull actually is seeing some play right now in the Zabu meta. And I have it down in here in D still because I still think it's too niche, and it might still be better to just play a different card a lot of times than Super Skrull. But when Darkhawk is popular, when Dino is popular, and Zabu is popular, Super Skrull is actually pretty decent. So on the day Zabu came out, Super Skrull could have been really good in some decks just because you get, basically if you miss your Zabu, you play your Super Skrull on 4. It gives you their Zabu because they were also playing it, and then you also get Darkhawk that they play, and then you also get Dino if they have that in their list as well. So it becomes pretty strong. But I do think that it is pretty much only good against that meta right now. It's very rare that you get enough value off of Super Skrull to be worth playing that card because it's only a 2-power card. So you're putting yourself a little bit behind. If you're not playing Zabu in your deck, Super Skrull is like pretty unplayable because playing it out for 4 just seems really not great. I think Super Skrull, though, of all these D tier, I think is the most playable just because I think it has the potential to be good in certain metas. But it's one of the ones I say every person I think that bought it for 6,000 tokens regretted it until this new meta popped up. But we'll see if they think it's still strong coming into, well, strong, I'd say, playable, I should say, in the next like month or so. Next up is M'Baku. A lot of people put M'Baku as the worst card. I actually think M'Baku is somewhat playable in Cerebro 2. We've played it to decent effect because it's basically just like a 1-drop that you can put it, like splash into Cerebro 2, and in the case that it doesn't get drawn, it'll come out of your deck to give you that extra power. And with Cerebro 2, it can get up to like 7 power if you have out the Cerebro, Cerebro, Mystique, and Blue Marvel. So it's basically it's a 7 power card that will just fly out of your deck if it didn't draw it. And if you did draw it, it's just a cheap card you can play out. So it's like not a huge downside. But it probably is better to put in like an Iceman or something instead. But M'Baku is somewhat playable in that deck, which is why it's not the very bottom of this list. But it still is something that's not worth picking up, and most people would consider the worst card that they've released. I think Hellcarrier also pretty bad. It's when you discard it, you get 3 random cards. I think that the fact that it's a 6/10 is also like, it's like a decent amount of power for 6, but there are just stronger 6/10s, and it's like, it seems like you want to play this when you want to like fill up your hand a little bit more. You're playing a discard deck and you want to have more targets, something to play out later. Again, just like random card generation, I'm not a huge fan of. I think it just the consistency of it is just too low, and I think that like this card is just not good enough to play over many other cards. It's not good enough in a slot, so you pretty much never want to play this in a list, and it doesn't really enable, I don't think, any real archetypes. I've seen some people make some lists that somewhat make this card work, but I think all those lists are like C or D lists that like it's not actually a good like list overall, even though it does win. But I think in Marvel Snap you can kind of climb with almost any deck if you're just like snapping or treating in a good way. So I think that it might be deceptive. Like I think the win rate for this kind of deck would be pretty low. Lastly, we have Sentry, which I put in D because I think it is just a worse 4-drop than most other 4-drops in its place, because you are playing a 4/8. Like you could be playing anything else, like a 4/8 that gives you a -8. So pretty much you have to be playing this with like Viper or something else that can kill your -8 for it to be ever worth it, I think. Because if you're just pretty much giving up on the right lane every single time you play Sentry, you have to go into that game plan that like you're gonna win left and mid every single game. So I think it is something that is maybe playable with Zabu again. But I do think that there's going to be just better 4-drops and better game plans than this. Like, it might be interesting to try it out, but I think most of the time, if you play Zabu and then you have Viper Sentry for turn 4, like, obviously that's like a really good combo if you can get that off. But how often are you going to get Zabu on 3 and then have Sentry and Viper in hand and have them have the space on the right that you don't have to worry about it? I mean, the space is probably not something you have to worry about too much, but it is like some sort of consideration because of just like locations and different things like that. I would think that, yeah, if you have any location that blocks you from playing cards on the right, the Sentry is just going to give you a -8 card, right? I mean, yeah, I just don't think Sentry's worth picking up. Like, it might be playable in a Zabu list. I just think there's going to be better 4-drops to play in Zabu list, so I would not spend your tokens on it. But yeah, I think that rounds out the entire list of current Series 4 and 5 cards and the new ones that are coming up this season. Tell me what you think in the comments. Do you guys think my list is correct? What would you move around? I know that there's a couple that you could kind of move, place here and there. I think as the meta shifts, you can kind of see the cards go up and down. So that's just going to happen. I think this is kind of like my list right now for the current meta. But yeah, I think it could definitely change in the future. So we'll probably update this list in the future as more cards come out. And we'll see maybe after the end of the month when we have all Sauron, Shanna, Dazzler, and Shadow King in the meta, we can take another look and maybe put them in their place after we've actually played with them. And we'll see how that goes. But yeah, thanks again. See you guys next time.